People should figure out who that they know holds a different view, but can be talked to as an equal, somebody who is willing to treat you well and not leap to conclusions about what you're saying. And then you can talk to them. You'll be shocked at what you discover.
Bret Weinstein, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd love to dig into kind of the background history. First, the big one is that I don't think most people have heard of like this idea of the intellectual dark web that's been taking the world by the storm. What is the story there of how that originated, and what is it really?
Yeah, that's a good question. The intellectual dark web is a concept. The term was coined by my brother, Eric Weinstein, and it describes, depends who you ask, but it's basically a loosely defined group of people who are committed to discussing contentious issues honorably, with decency, with the objective of figuring out what's true rather than winning. And for quite some time, we have, I would say, beaten the odds. That is to say, we've been able to navigate difficult issues without being canceled. Not that attempts have not been made, but we still persist. And so in some sense, it's something that should be very uncontroversial, which is the idea that people who disagree should be able to interact honorably with each other. But it has become something of a lightning rod by virtue of the fact that there are many amongst us who would like to control the scope of conversation, control the scope of legitimate perspectives, and they do not seem to appreciate any group of people who are interested in simply following the conversation where it goes.
And who's part of the group?
Well, that's an interesting question, and the answer is there's no formal membership. So in some sense, the formulation I like best is that IDW, as it's called, is actually a protocol. And so those who operate the protocol are, in some sense, in the IDW. But membership is often taken to include Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, my brother and myself, my wife Heather Hying, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, a host of others, people you've probably encountered one way or another, but the fact is we have frequently ended up talking to each other because it's hard to find viable spaces for conversation in the outer world. I might be the farthest left person in the IDW, and I consider myself very liberal. And Ben Shapiro might be the farthest right person in it, and he's quite conservative. So it does not have the characteristics that people typically associate with a fraternity. It is not people of like mind. It is people of very different minds that are interested in participating together.
Yeah, and I'm very familiar with what you guys discuss, and it's clear that you guys bring a lot of logic and reason to it. And at the end of the day, it seems there's a lot of similar values that you guys share. And it's surprising, almost shocking, when I see the adverse reactions of these two different spectrums where there's a group of people that absolutely love you guys and are like diehard followers. And then you get the other adverse reactions from the other end. And there's really no middle ground almost. It seems like there's only one or two reactions, either love or hate. I'm wondering like what your take is of why there's been this two spectrums that's so diverse.
I think the answer is fairly clear and quite sad, which is that most people have accepted a world in which the purpose of discussion is political. And so if your purpose is political, then you don't want free agents. And so you attempt to stamp out free agency. And so there have been a lot of accusations hurled at us. If one actually digs into those accusations, you'll find none of them hold any water. I mean, we're accused of all sorts of things like being alt-right, being grifters, whatever the accusations are. But if you check into the behavior of the people who are typically under this umbrella, you don't find this at all. So I think the answer is just simply people who are trying to control the narrative do not want people who are interested in not having the narrative controlled.
Right, right. And the idea is that you guys are able to talk about the things that are pretty much hidden from the mainstream media because I guess they're being controlled by these big networks and they're allowed to say certain things and they've got sponsors. It's a pretty unique time because of the fact that you guys have this direct relationship with consumers and users. Sorry, not users, but audience members on YouTube, podcast channels. Like it definitely would not have been able to exist even maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And it seems like that's kind of this refreshing message that people are able to be, they're craving this kind of message that's more honest and logical in some sense.
Well, there is a huge appetite for it. That is absolutely clear. And it is startling the first time you encounter it. So not only do we have Joe Rogan with an absolutely huge and loyal audience, but we also have done a number of live events. And in particular, I was the moderator in a debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, who had a famous disagreement about the nature of truth. And so we met in Vancouver for 2 consecutive nights, and it was an audience of 3,000 people each night. And if you didn't know what was on stage, you would have sworn that these people had shown up to see their favorite band, right? This was rock and roll. And that's a very odd reaction for an audience to have to a discussion about epistemology. And yet there they were, right? And so, yes, I think what we're really seeing is the result of a kind of starvation, that there's so much inauthenticity that even for a topic that is as frankly dry and arcane as what is the nature of truth, there is a desire to see anybody who can confront it courageously and with decency. And so anyway, that's a very positive thing. As to what you said before, I think in past decades, the question of what advertisers want in major publications has been more prominent. But of late, we now have this new phenomenon where there are sets of beliefs for which there is little or no support that have nonetheless taken over from the inside of these institutions, having nothing to do with advertisers, but having to do with large numbers of staff members willing to stigmatize each other inside institutions like the New York Times in order to control what shows up in their pages. And so it is another mechanism by which the sense making that we do is being deranged. And so I think what we're really seeing is a hunger for honest sense making, and the appetite for it is almost unlimited.
One of the recent things, fairly recent things, but I'm assuming it's been going on for a bit longer, is the Shutdown Stem. I don't think a lot of people know the story actually. So it'd be good to get a quick background in terms of what exactly has been happening and what's been the stance on it. Because when I first took a look at it, I was a little bit confused as well myself.
Well, it's not surprising. In fact, if you look at any of these issues and you take in all of the information, you are liable to find yourself passing through a period of confusion before you figure it out. So Shutdown Stem was a hashtag that showed up suddenly early in the George Floyd protests and riots. And it's a confusing hashtag because it was being broadcast by many of the leading scientific institutions that we have, like the AAAS and Nature Magazine and MIT. And so it functions as what we call a Mott and Bailey. And Mott and Bailey is a particular style of argument in which something can be interpreted 2 ways. And one of those ways is extremely radical and therefore vulnerable to challenge. And the other interpretation is extremely secure and uncontroversial. And so something is deployed in the form of the Bailey, that is to say, the radical version. And then when it is attacked, it retreats to the Mott, to the secure version. So Shutdown Stem means, if you match it up with the claims inside of the movement, it means that science is a mode of oppression deployed by Europeans to keep other people down. And therefore, Shutdown Stem really means unmake science, which is, of course, the most radical possible agenda one could have. Science is so much the basis of the modern world that, frankly, if you were to unmake it, you would starve 3 billion people almost instantly as a result of the fact that the Haber-Bosch process is necessary to get enough nitrogen into the biological cycle to grow enough food to feed the world's population. So this is not a matter of taste. This is a matter of life and death. However, when one challenges the idea that STEM is somehow a tool of oppression, or in my case, when one says that in fact the thing to do about STEM is to democratize the tools that are found there as widely as possible so that people who are oppressed have those tools at their disposal, because those tools are the highest quality ones to which we can grant access. The challenge comes back: you've misunderstood. Shutdown STEM was intended to be a symbolic gesture of solidarity with Black people for one day. That's it. And so by dodging between these two interpretations, a very radical agenda is advanced in the guise of something mundane and almost unassailable. You will find the same thing in the argument about abolishing the police. Abolish doesn't really mean abolish. It means defund. What does defund mean? It means demilitarize. And what this really means is taking some of the resources that have been delivered to the police and redirecting them to building community. I mean, who could be against that, right? On the other hand, if you look carefully, even in the pages of the New York Times, you will find the claim that no, by abolish the police, what we actually mean is abolish the police, like get rid of them completely, which is an insane proposal, one that will hurt people who are oppressed more than anyone else because their neighborhoods are liable to be much more dangerous.
I'm curious to know like what your take is in terms of how Nature magazine, all these institutions are involved, just because it seems like what they're putting out is the idea of people of color, particularly African Americans, are not involved or represented as much in as researchers or as scientists, and that's like a way for them to include them to be involved more. I'm not sure exactly what their action plan are to help that movement, but that was my understanding of it.
Well, the central concept here is verificationism, which it sounds like you have a background in STEM, so you probably know all about it. But for any of your viewers who don't, let me just say that the science functions vastly better if you take an approach where you attempt to disprove things that you are interested in investigating rather than attempt to prove them, because you can often prove a false thing by finding some evidence that points in its direction. But if you attempt to prove something false and you can't do it, it tends very strongly to be true or to be close to the truth. So what we have are arguments that are deployed in the expectation that you will try to prove them rather than disprove them. So if you want to establish that Shutdown STEM is really just about increasing representation of underrepresented groups in science, you will find that evidence. It has been placed in front of you so that you will find it. And like everybody else, I would be thrilled to see proportional representation of all groups in STEM. That would be, as a liberal, that is an ideal to which I think we should aspire. But it does not mean that the failure to attain that kind of representation is the result of racism, which is frequently claimed. And it is also not consistent with the internal logic of the movement, which says things like, well, it typically quotes Audre Lorde, who said that the master's tools cannot be used to take down the master's house, which is used to imply there is no point in studying science because science is the tool of your oppressor, and it has been, frankly, but that it will not work for you. It's as if it is some kind of spell that only works in the hands of those who wish to oppress, which is, of course, nonsense. So it should not surprise you that when looking, you found plenty of evidence that Shutdown STEM was a very mild program of symbolic support for something any reasonable person would be in favor of. I find that evidence too. But if you look deeper, you will find evidence that no, in fact, it is a challenge to science itself.
And why don't you think there are more African Americans in STEM, especially in the modern age, where a lot of there? I mean, there's obviously a huge inequality, but it's certainly not in the slave days back in the days.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I must say it's one I thought a lot about as I was teaching students at Evergreen, where I had many Black students in a STEM class. And anyway, this is one of the topics of discussion that occurred with some regularity. What I've come to understand is the following thing. There are many good reasons that a rational person does not want to go into STEM that have nothing to do with the value of STEM or the level to which it is rewarding as a career if you can make one there. The problem is it's actually a very arcane problem, and one that most people don't understand the basis of. But universities are fueled by something called grant overhead. Grant overhead is the fraction of a grant that goes to the institution, and it's typically something like half of a big scientific grant. So, $1 million grant would contain $500,000 of overhead that the institution then uses to do all the things that universities do. The problem with this is that it creates a perverse incentive for these institutions to overproduce PhDs. Right? Instead of paying for professors to teach good classes, what they try to do is free the people who can get the grants to write grants effectively full time. And the way to do that is to get graduate students to do the real work of the teaching. How do you get graduate students to do that? Well, you could pay them an honest wage, but that would be expensive. So what you do instead is you give them a degree, and that degree is the thing of value. So they will work for very low wages. They are described as students rather than workers, so they don't have normal worker protections. And so the result of this is that we have a glut of PhDs. We are producing many more PhDs than we have spaces for them in science. So the answer to your question then is, let's say that Black people are more likely to have come from disadvantaged circumstances, right? More likely to be the first in their family, for example, to go to college and then to figure out what professional or graduate school to go to. Does it make sense for somebody in such a position to go into science? Well, if I was advising them, I'd probably say no, because the chances that you will make it into a professorship just because you've gotten through graduate school are very low. There aren't enough professorships. Whereas if you go to medical school, you are almost certain to end up as a doctor who can pay off their loans and help support their family and all of these things. So the point is, there's a rational reason for people who are new to an economic stratum not to go into science that has nothing to do with the desirability of scientific knowledge. It just has to do with the economics of the job market. So, frankly, I think that's a problem that is demanding a remedy, but the remedy does not involve pretending that it is racism that is keeping Black people from showing up at the upper echelon of science. It is perverse incentives inside the university system that aren't about race at all.
Yeah. I mean, my take also was that when I look at the careers that I would have pursued coming in here as an immigrant, and I'm sure for most people, you kind of look to what other people that look like you, that you can relate to, that have been up there. And I saw doctors, I saw lawyers, possibly I saw accountants, and it wasn't necessarily a super inspiring thing. Now we have Andrew Yang who's running for president, and it's completely changed the field. But I wonder if it's going to be this continuous cycle where, in this case, for Black people, they don't see other PhDs or other researchers or other scientists that are in this field right now. And because of this issue that you have, and it's only going to continuously go on this negative spiral, because I do agree, as a child, you look up to people that look like you.
Well, I agree. And it's even worse because people are broadcasting the message that somehow science is a tool of Europeans that is being used to oppress others. And so there's a stigma now that comes along with even thinking about a career in science for people of color, for example. So it's a tragedy, one end to the other. And really, we have to overcome these very toxic, wrong messages, and we have to democratize scientific thinking because it's the most powerful tool you can have at your disposal.
Yeah, and you don't think? I mean, so we had Dave Rubin on. And we were talking about the controversial case that happened with Asian Americans in Harvard, and he had a very strong stance on it, which was that they are limiting the number of Asian Americans, despite so it basically wasn't a meritocracy system, and it was about a diversity system that needed to meet a certain quota. Asian Americans had the grades, but I guess they decided to go with personality factor to limit the number of Asian Americans entering Harvard. Do you think it could be a factor that Black people weren't able to get in because not enough because they limited the number of people in order to meet a diversity quota?
Well, I would say there have been a large number of, let's say, unintended consequences that came along with well-intended policies designed to increase diversity. One of them has to do with the assumption that people who might have benefited from a quota face when they do succeed, which is that they have not succeeded on merit. So that disincentivizes people who want to succeed on merit from going into something where there's a quota because they don't want to be dismissed as having gotten in with a lower standard. So anyway, this is one of the, as a liberal, this is one of the critiques I would direct at other liberals, is that we very frequently are interested in solution making, but we don't appreciate the unintended consequences that come along with those solutions, and that we would be wise to think more carefully about them so that we can minimize them.
Right. Another event that's I want to bring up is the event with Evergreen. I encourage people to Google it. What did surprise me was the fact that protesters had altercations with you specifically, despite you trying to, it seems like you were standing up for the people that were fighting the cause, but I wasn't quite sure why the altercations happened.
Well, nothing about the Evergreen story was what it appeared, really. First thing to know is that the people who were so convinced that I was a racist were people I had never met. They were students who had been told that I was a racist by faculty colleagues who had other reasons to want to move me out of the way. And basically, it comes down to this. There were policy proposals being advanced at Evergreen that would have transferred power. Evergreen had a very flat hierarchy. It was literally the case that even adjunct faculty had the same standing as tenured faculty, right? So it was a radically flat hierarchy. But there was a desire to create a race-based hierarchy, which would have placed some faculty in a position of power over other faculty. And I was standing up against this in a faculty context where, frankly, students weren't allowed and were unaware of what was even occurring. But the people who were attempting to gain power felt it necessary to get rid of me because I was the primary obstacle to their power grab. So they whipped students into a frenzy who ultimately came to protest me at my class and demand my firing. But the story it's not the one that was placed in front of you in order for you to think students rose up against a professor who at the very least must have been racially ignorant, or why would students be rebelling? My students stood by me. My students knew me well, and they knew there was nothing to the charge. Students who had not met me were deceived and turned into a protest movement, but that was really done for the purpose of driving me out rather than because there was anything to it.
Yeah, and this is kind of this going back to this idea of headline reading, especially fed with algorithms that despite students wanting to have a good intent, if they're not fed the right information or they're fed the wrong information, it makes them go the complete other way.
The funny thing is, I wouldn't call them altercations, because although I think the threat of physical violence there was physical violence on the campus, I never faced it. I think it was possible that I would have if I had encountered the rioters at the wrong point. But in any case, I did continue to have interactions, and it was very common that I would make progress inside of an interaction And then that progress would be unmade when the person who had realized that they were dealing with somebody who didn't match the villain they had been told they were up against would return to the group, and they would be effectively reprogrammed. So that was a very frustrating phenomenon, but I think it does tell us exactly what needs to happen, which is you need an institution that makes it very clear, here's how we settle our differences, right? We do it honorably, we do it publicly, we do it with generosity. And, I would have been perfectly happy to sit in an auditorium with people who thought my emails contained racism and to have a discussion about it, right? That would have been perfectly in keeping. But instead, the institution not only tolerated rioting and false accusations, it fostered them. At one point, the police, the campus police, who happened to be under the discretion of the college president, were told to stand down as rioters were roving the campus with weapons and doxing my students, looking for me. So, for the president to tell the police to not enforce the law is to encourage this behavior, which, at Evergreen, it included, frankly, kidnapping of administrators. So we have to enforce the law, and then we have to enforce some standards about how we settle disagreements. And Evergreen didn't do that. We saw exactly what happened. It all unfolded in a week. And unfortunately, the world did not pay attention to the Evergreen story at the right level. And we are now seeing the same patterns in major American cities, including Portland, the one I live in. So it's a predictable disaster, let's say.
So you were saying that you would get into a conversation, let's say, I don't want to call it an altercation, where you would explain what's happening, what was actually going on. And you're saying they would go back into their group and you would see them again and they would have just completely went the other way.
Let me give you one example. This happened multiple times, but there's one example that I find particularly telling, and I should say particularly troubling. There was a meeting that is now famous on the first day of the protests, sort of right on the cusp of them moving from protest to riot. And this meeting was held in an old cafeteria on the top of the library building, and it was very heated. Now, I did not have to be there. I elected to be there because they were calling for my head, and I thought I should be there to defend myself. Some of my students, including numerous students of color, were very concerned about my attending that meeting and insisted, frankly, on going with me to defend me and protect me from what they were concerned might happen. But in any case, the meeting nearly boiled over into violence several times, all caught on film. It contained much that was despicable. The chairs, we were told, were only for people of color, and white people were to stand, and the water, this is a state college, mind you, the water was there for black folks, and all sorts of nonsense. But anyway, at the end of the meeting, I walked out with my students and a young woman that I had never met, who I think may have had Asperger's, I'm not certain. But anyway, a young woman, black woman, chased me down and started to question me. And at first, it was clear that she was not, that she was concerned that I might be what she had been told. But anyway, we got into a discussion, and over time, I started to make headway with her, right? Because what I was saying was not inconsistent with a world of equal access, in which everybody has the means to flourish. And the protesters who became rioters recognized that something was going wrong. They saw this discussion happening out in front of the library, and they challenged her, and they told her, "Don't talk to me." And she challenged them, and she said, "No, I want to find out whether he is a bad guy, and he doesn't seem like one to me." She says this on tape. And anyway, we have our discussion, and I believe her eyes were opened. And the next day, she was marched out in front of a rally on the campus and made to read a statement that revealed that all of the progress we had made had evaporated. And what's more, I must say this is painful to me as a dyslexic who does not like reading in public because I often stumble over words. She did not do a good job of reading the statement. And whereas this person clearly had good mental capacity, her reading out loud capacity basically was subpar. And so not only did they force her effectively to recant what she had discovered, but they embarrassed her. They humiliated her in front of this audience. And I don't know how much they understood what they were doing, but they were effectively punishing investigation of the truth. And I must say, it struck me as extremely cold and quite telling of what their desires were and their intent was.
Wow. This is like Sansa Stark betraying her own father, Ned Stark, in Game of Thrones.
In that case, she does it to save his life. Right? Yes. This was different.
This is probably saving her own life in some sense.
Well, who knows? But let's just say the pattern was consistent. Every time I had a potentially productive discussion, it got uninvented behind the scenes. And I think the point was they didn't want progress. It's specifically what they didn't want. They wanted power.
Right. I mean, from the student's perspective, I guess what they're searching for is this sense of purpose and this power in some sense. And it seems like your message and the fact that they were already so hyped up about it beforehand, when you started to make sense and when you started to actually bring in logic and defy what they were trying to fight for and what gave them purpose, I imagine it was them trying to do everything that they can to continue that movement.
So this is what we saw at Evergreen very clearly, was that most of the people who were involved in the protesting were unaware of the true motivation of, for example, my antagonists on the faculty and a tiny number of protesters who I believe were bad actors who also wanted and then got power. So the key is to convey that those who claim to be your allies may not be your allies. They may be using you. And it is incumbent on you to figure out whether or not the thing for which you are marching is what you say it is, or whether it is actually unstated. So the fact of many well-intentioned people being used by a small number of folks with another agenda is really the key to understanding what's taking place.
Yeah, and another one clearly that a lot of the younger generation has been rallied up about is the defunding of the police. And obviously with stuff around George Floyd, that's really escalated over the past few months. Do you feel like defunding the police is another agenda made by, I don't know, the government or other institutions?
Defunding the police is two things. It's a truly insane idea that some people are advancing because they don't understand. You can see what the police do wrong. Occasionally it's captured on video, for example. You cannot see the degree to which even policing that is not high quality results in a tremendous decrease in violence and other crime. And so if we were to be able to run the experiment, basically if we could let people see what their own neighborhood would look like in the absence of policing, there'd be no question on anybody's mind about whether or not abolishing the police made any sense. Now, I am not saying that there is not justification to rethink the way we do policing. There may be, and frankly, a total revamp of policing would make sense. It may even be true that there's some way to refigure civilization so that much less policing is necessary. But you certainly can't start by eliminating the police. That will result in a massive increase in crime, which we have already seen in the places where this is being experimented with.
What do you mean rethinking the civilization?
If we understood that, for example, it was important to provide everybody a minimum guarantee of well-being as long as they were willing to play by civilization's rules, right? So that bad luck didn't result in you being on the street, for example, that you had a minimum quality of life that was guaranteed. But in exchange for that minimum quality of life, we expect you to play by the rules, and we expect you to try to be productive and to discover something decent you can contribute. If we had that world, many fewer people would find themselves without good options. I'm not saying that this would instantaneously change anything, but over time, that would result in a shift in values. And it might be, in fact, I would predict that it would be, that you would find much less lawlessness in such a world, in which case you could have many fewer police. They wouldn't be as necessary. Now, they will always be somewhat necessary, or at least something that does the job of the police will always be necessary. And no, it can't be self-appointed community patrols, because those self-appointed community patrols are an opportunity for people who want power to pretend to do the job of the police and to do something else instead. But in any case, I believe all options should be on the table, that we should be very careful about implementing things for the reason I said up front, that unintended consequences loom very large. And so one should be very cautious about upending a system that somewhat works in favor of something that hasn't been tried. But we should be open to this discussion. We should not, however, be open to the idea that you can uninvent the police suddenly and not see a massive spike in crime. That's guaranteed.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the idea of filtering people for high values and the utmost characters so that this stuff doesn't happen. And unfortunately, it's that one bad apple that kind of ruins it for the rest of the police force, because oftentimes it is a minority of the people that have that issue. To me, at least, it doesn't seem like defunding is the issue, just from like a proper training perspective, but also just from a salary perspective. I mean, how can someone be motivated living in New York City or Los Angeles getting paid $40,000 a year with inflation and not have corruption? I mean, I live in Mexico City part of the time, and this is the issue with Mexico City, is that they're always looking to target foreigners, which is like the worst thing you can do in a developing country that makes a lot of money from tourism, and defunding it would even make that worse.
I absolutely agree with you that it is not clear that you should move in the direction of less funding. Certainly, I'm no fan of militarized police, but I think what people need to realize is that in part, police are being used to keep a broken system functional, right? They've become a punitive mechanism, which is not supposed to be their role. The solution to that could involve lots of things, but one argument is that you would want more funding, or at least you would want to apply more funding to salaries, so you could accumulate higher quality people who would be less prone to violence and corruption, and that would be the direction of the solution. In any case, what you can certainly say is that you do not want your policy to be formulated by a tiny number of people, attacking federal buildings in the streets. You want policy to be formulated by people who are free to navigate these difficult issues. You want them armed with the best information that they can have at their disposal, and you want to proceed with great caution. Right? So the idea that we are suddenly defunding police in many different places because a mob in the street who does not represent the viewpoint of, I believe, any reasonable person, that they are in charge of the direction of our policy, is evidence that something's gone very seriously wrong.
Yeah, and I imagine the problem with, just given how long it takes to change pass a bill and to change the laws, is that once you do it and there's severe consequences of defunding, to reverse that means that, number one, you have to get all of these politicians to get over their egos, to admit that they were wrong. But so much chaos would have already upended all of these major cities, more than that's already happening, that it's definitely crazy. But rethinking the civilization, that's an interesting point that I do want to go over. I mean, it seems like you were talking about a form of UBI, whether it's the exact number of $1,000 a month. We've actually had Andrew Yang on. Would love to dig into in terms of how to make something like that possible, in your opinion.
Well, I would say, first of all, I'm very interested in Andrew. I quite like him. I think he's got exactly the characteristics we need in a national leader, which is to say he's creative. He isn't driven by ego. He's clearly patriotic. And so we need more more Andrew Yang, not just in the form of Andrew Yang, but we need more like him. I'm not totally convinced that UBI is the right way to go. I think UBI has some perverse incentives built into it, sort of a mini version of the problems with communism, where it incentivizes free riding. So I would say the policy, though, can be upgraded to something called participation income. Participation income effectively is a UBI in exchange for productivity. So this also has potential hazards built into it. But in any case, again, the solution to this is to get wise, creative people who are inclined towards saying the truth, irrespective of how it affects their personal well-being, to gather those people and figure out what the optimal policy is from the point of view of accomplishing the goal of something like UBI without the perverse incentives. And no doubt we could come up with a policy that would be highly effective and for which the hazards would be greatly reduced.
So how would you measure something like productivity, I guess? Is it number of hours worked?
I sure wouldn't. So anyway, I am not a room full of wise people. I am maybe one wise person at best. But I would say you don't want a policy like that, because for one thing, if you measure productivity and you reward it, especially proportionally, what you'll get is a system in which you get certain kinds of productivity and you eliminate others. So in other words, I don't want to punish somebody who gambles on a really good idea that might radically improve human well-being, and then it doesn't work out. I want to reward that person. Right? Yes. If you gamble on a good idea that has the potential to improve our lives and it doesn't work out, that's not on you. In fact, we want that behavior to spread. So it can't be that we measure productivity. What we have to measure, or maybe measure is even the wrong word. What we have to incentivize is behaviors that tend to pay off over the aggregate. In other words, if it takes 1,000 people failing for one person to come up with the thing that causes human well-being to increase, then we need to pay the cost of the failure of those 1,000 people rather than have them be punished by economic jeopardy when, in fact, they were doing our bidding all along. So. Right. What I want is the room full of people to figure out how do we do that so that you can't game the system, so that in order to get your participation income, you actually have to engage in behaviors that stand a good chance of improving things, but that you're protected for bad luck or for taking a gamble that was a good one but didn't work out, whatever the structure is. And yeah. Wouldn't it be great if we had such conversations and policy was actually driven by them rather than the system we do have, where policy is now driven by special interests that, if anything, are driven to prevent progress because progress threatens them, whereas keeping the status quo keeps them in power.
This is kind of the rising issue with an Asian American running for president, calling him Kevin Yang or John Yang, and doing everything they can, it seems like, to minimize his influence in the campaign. In the America that we know today, do you think an Asian American could ever become president?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have no doubt about it. In fact, I think there's a decent chance that if Andrew had not run into the obstacles that the Democratic Party put in his way directly and indirectly, that he stood a very good chance of winning. And the fact is, as difficult as it might be to imagine an Asian person winning that role, it's even more difficult to imagine a black guy doing it. Mm-hmm. How about a black guy named Barack, right? Mm-hmm. How about a black guy named Barack not only attaining the office, but winning it twice? So I think the thing is, I just don't accept that that Americans are so biased on such superficial characteristics that they won't see past them. Yeah. I think that's a story that we've been induced to believe, but there's nothing to it.
This is definitely something that seems to be more prevalent in America. I mean, when they did the survey of Barack Obama, I think were like 60% of people that were white called him biracial, and the majority of the people that were black called him black. There is this very deep-rooted racism, even in our language, that I'm noticing. I mean, even the word of being blackballed or blacklisted, or what I've heard also is like the song that we teach our kids, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe." If you replace tiger with, a word that a lot of people don't want to say, obviously, is there's deep racism in it that we just don't even realize, but it's so embedded into our everyday language that we've been taught since we were a little kid.
Well, I think the thing is, you don't have to reverse the little stuff. I don't agree that it's deep rooted. I think it's there, but it's shallowly rooted. And if you talk to most
Yes.
Americans, they don't want a system that's biased on the basis of race. They're not
Yeah.
interested in it. Conservatives and liberals tend to disagree about how fair the system is today, but in general, it's only the farthest fringes that actually want a system that is biased. Everybody agrees that the best system is one in which everybody has an equal shot, right? We all do. And for good reason. That is the best system. It's something like 86% of the country has basic agreement on what things should be like. They're not extremists. And unfortunately, the extremists on both fringes are driving the conversation and leading us to believe that these problems are much deeper than they actually are, which isn't to say that they don't exist. But we, at some point, should probably talk about Unity 2020, which is a plan that I have deployed for allowing the American people effectively to recapture the White House. And that plan involves, within the confines of the constitutional protections and presidential term limits, it actually envisions something else in which you would have a pattern in the White House that would continue until things were substantially fixed. So the plan, for those who haven't heard it, is that we would draft two candidates, one from the left, one from the right. They would be drafted under the agreement that once in office, they would govern as a team. They would discuss everything except where that wasn't practical, and everything would be decided jointly. The team, the person who ran in the top spot, would be chosen by a coin flip. After 4 years, the spots would reverse and the president would run as vice president and vice versa. And this would continue until one party had been in the presidency twice and they would be then replaced on the team. And this could, in principle, go on indefinitely. Now, of course, the American people would always have the opportunity to remove these people from office were they to fail, or to disappoint or to evidence corruption. But the most important thing is that the system we have now freezes out anybody who isn't willing to participate in corruption. So by the time we get to the general election, we never have a good choice left to us. So in any case, my point would be term limits. Term limits have an upside and a downside. One can imagine a despot getting into power and continuing there as a result of a cult of personality or something like that, in which case term limits would be a blessing. On the other hand, you can also imagine that somebody gets into office who actually succeeds in confronting the corrupt structures that have caused the nation to falter, and then having to leave office after 2 terms with no appropriate follow-up. So anyway, it can work both ways. The nice thing about the Unity 2020 proposal is that it honors the part of term limits that is protective while allowing continuity if that is desirable. If it proves to work and the American public wants to see the same style of governance continue, they would be free to vote for that indefinitely.
And you're saying that switching the roles from president to vice president and flipping that after the next term, you're saying that would avoid corruption?
No, the primary hedge against corruption in the plan is that we would draft 2 people who have 3 characteristics. They would have to be courageous, they would have to be capable, and they would have to be patriots. Now, my feeling is if you name any 2 people who have those 3 characteristics, and you tell me in office they will govern by consensus, right? Already, I'm not worried. Does that mean that the policies that I, as a liberal, want are going to be enacted? No, probably not. But what it does mean is that my values are definitely going to be in the room. There's somebody in that room, in the discussion, who understands the world that I believe ought to exist and will speak to it. It's not what policy will be, but it will at least be present in the discussion. The fact of them reversing roles every 4 years means that you couldn't get a situation where, let's say, the conservative had won the first coin flip and then just ignored the liberal in order to make conservative policy. Now, by choosing a patriot, you wouldn't be likely to have that, but this is a second layer of protection, right? What it means is if you got somebody who did this for 4 years, you would be guaranteed that in the next round they wouldn't have that opportunity, which also increases their incentive not to play the game that way. So the purpose of the plan is to neutralize all of the normal objections so that the one thing that needs to happen, the one thing that never happens with our current system, is that the people are actually represented at the top of the system that is supposed to protect them, right? If we are represented there, there's a tremendous amount we can do to make things better, right? Those things don't get done because they run afoul of special interests who actually have veto power over everything at the moment.
Gotcha. Yeah, I love the idea. I just can't get this image out of my head of the vice president and the president doing a coin flip and being nationalized on television and say, you're going to be president for the next 4 years.
But don't you love it? I mean, doesn't that actually sound like us?
It sounds like a pretty comical idea, yeah.
Well, I got to say, I am up for anything honorable and different that is well thought out. So I think the thing is, yes, this would look very different. I think in considering it, people ought to say, well, that's interesting. This is happening entirely within the confines of the Constitution that we already have. It doesn't require any changes, and so it doesn't carry the hazard of changing the Constitution. It's just something that was previously unimagined, right? And it's hard to find how it would be abused. The whole thing is designed to neutralize abuse. So in any case, were it true that we had two viable candidates offered by the major parties, then I would imagine Unity 2020 would not have the potential to work. But to offer a plan that clearly tends to neutralize the bad influences on governance at a moment when the two parties have both delivered us candidates that are absolutely not viable means that, we have a national emergency and somebody has offered a plan in which we could address it. And how much better would you feel come January if you had a team of patriots that were committed to navigating these issues so that they did not fall out on one side of the political spectrum or the other? If they ascended the stage on Inauguration Day, wouldn't you feel greatly relieved at our safety? Don't you think the planet would breathe a sigh of relief that America had gotten over its partisan insanity?
I mean, based on the two candidates that I see now, definitely seems like a promising plan. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Speaking of different, I mean, when we had Scott Adams on, he was talking about his prediction of Joe Biden. I guess he's looking to pick a woman VP, and the idea of that they would flip the card so that the VP would become the president. It seems like he was pretty strong in terms of his stance on it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, we've got a doozy of a puzzle here. So I don't think if Biden ran and won that he would last 4 years. I feel almost certain he would be stepping down in 2 years, if not 1 year. So in some sense,
because of his age, you're saying?
Yeah, I am not seeing compelling evidence even that there are good days on which he does not show signs of substantial decline and bad days. What I'm seeing is decline that reliably shows up each appearance, and we know this doesn't get better. So I'm not a Joe Biden fan, even if he was young and vital. I think he's too much a part of the Democratic machine, and therefore he's just a part of the corruption. But in his declining state, it's not even safe to have him in office, right? Given the dangers that we face on an international stage, having somebody who is in severe mental decline in that office is a daily hazard. So in some sense, a vote for Biden is a vote for the DNC. But my guess is internally, they already know that they will have to do some kind of a swap. And Adams might be right that it could be before the election, in which case we would have an, I believe, unprecedented situation on our hands where the DNC has effectively advanced a stalking horse and we're going to have a swap. Maybe it would be Kamala Harris, which I would find a very frightening prospect. But something is afoot. I don't think the American public is in on it. It certainly isn't about the interests of the American public, and it is incredibly dangerous in light of the partnership that the Democratic Party seems to be striking with this, with the protest movement in the streets, which is advancing these policies that we know will be a disaster.
There's definitely a divide in terms of how the United States, in terms of how people stand. And the fact that there's really just a two-party system, an electoral system that seems like there doesn't pose any options.
No, in fact, the purpose of it is to stamp out the real options in the primaries so that by the time you get to the general election, you have to basically put one spin or another on the status quo, which is exactly why I believe Andrew Yang ran up against the obstacles, many of them preposterous and racist. I mean, I remember seeing a picture of what appeared to be a randomly chosen Asian man with Andrew Yang's name on him on CNN, displaying the results of, I don't know, one caucus or another, or one primary or another. This is just, it's despicable. Yeah. So stamping out the good options in the primaries has to stop, which means we have to confront the major parties and dethrone them.
What's like the core root of why an independent party can't rise to power and stand with the Republicans and the Democrats?
Well, somehow we have to break the hegemony of the two parties. The obstacle to that is that structural elements in our system tend towards two parties. So first past the post voting causes these sort of large, incoherent coalitions to form in order to gain power. So the fact that our system just game theoretically defaults to two parties is a problem. Now the question is, can we do something within the confines of that system to fix that tendency? Ranked choice voting is one solution that will tend to solve this problem, and I think there are others, but we're going to have to think a bit outside the box. Yeah. The fact is, the founders did not understand they didn't understand game theory, they didn't understand evolution, so they couldn't have predicted some of the things that would evolve in the context of the system they set in motion. Now we do know what happens, and it's time for us to adjust it. Basically, they gave us a marvelous prototype, and it's time for the next iteration.
How does game theory apply in this situation?
Well, as I just said, if you have first past the post voting, then the idea is what you have to do is arrange your coalitions to maximize the chance that you're first past the post, rather than some sort of a division of power between a larger number of entities in which deals could be struck. So there's no reason that the party of big business should be the anti-abortion party, for example. There's no logical reason to connect those two things. Yeah. But they find themselves connected by virtue of a kind of unhealthy coalition building, right? The big business is not an interest that finds its bidding easily done in a system where workers outnumber those in big business by many to one, right? Likewise, a position in which there can be no family planning after a sperm has reached an egg, that is also a fringe position. In order for these fringe positions to be dominant, they have to gather together ahead of time in order to agree that they are in fact one slate of beliefs, which they aren't. So anyway, if you take that pattern and you extend it over both parties, you find two incoherent slates, neither of which represent the beliefs of almost anybody. And what it does is it prevents a natural process of policymaking where the real interests of the people, which are frankly easy to demonstrate, the people want good schools, right? They're willing to pay for them. They want a fair system that gives everybody opportunity. They want safety from the things that threaten them, like being wiped out by medical debt, right? They want to be able to send their kids to college. They don't want the credit issuers to be protected by preventing academic debt from being discharged in bankruptcy. There are all sorts of things that just simply are in the interests of so many people that they would be unstoppable in a system that didn't default to this power gathering arrangement. But we can't get there if we don't think outside the box.
I do want to close it off because I do also want to provide some actionable things for people to take away from the message that we've been giving them. Obviously, there's a lot of things that are happening around the world right now, and certainly thinking around the box, using logic, all these things are applicable for people to take action, to get out of their comfort zone, to do the things they need to do. What is one actionable small thing that they can do after listening to this podcast? Something small, something short, something quick that they can do right after that can help them move forward, can help them think outside the box, think more creatively, think more logically.
I don't want to say it's a small thing. It's a big thing, but I think it's a necessary thing. People should figure out who that they know holds a different view, but can be talked to as an equal, somebody who is willing to treat you well and not leap to conclusions about what you're saying. And then you can talk to them. So, for somebody who believes that Donald Trump is the greatest threat to the nation and that he must be eliminated from office, such a person should find somebody who supports Donald Trump and is willing to talk about why. And they should have a conversation, because what we have is a system in which we have these kind of reciprocal blind spots, right? Where your antagonist is ununderstandable. And the fact is, your antagonist actually arrives where they do through a process. And they can't understand you either. So to the extent that you feel coherent and you think they're crazy, you are incorrect. And it is very important. The penalties for talking across these lines have been elevated so that we continue not to understand each other. And the most important thing you can do is figure out how, even just in a personal relationship with a neighbor, how you can eliminate the danger of speaking openly, and then do it. You'll be shocked at what you discover.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it is a real struggle, just given how three things we can't really talk about is four things: sex, money, religion, and politics. It just seems like it's not even something we're supposed to talk about in the dinner table. So there's no conversations even being initiated, which further extenuates this bubble, given the social media algorithms that are just feeding us what we want to see and what we want to hear.
Absolutely. And I will say this is a little more difficult in the time of COVID, but the sun is still shining in the Northern Hemisphere. COVID does not transmit well outdoors at all. So I would still say take precautions. But you know what? Have a barbecue. Invite that person over. Have a beer with them. Look them in the eye. And you'll be amazed how much camaraderie you find, and how good, frankly, it feels to discover that the enemy you've been told exists isn't who you thought they were, and that, in fact, you can relate to them, even if you don't reach agreement, which you probably won't. At least you'll understand how they end up where they are.
Bret Weinstein, thanks so much for being on. Where can people find you online? Where should people go?
They can find me at Bret Weinstein on Twitter. Bret has one T. They can find the Dark Horse podcast on YouTube or on their favorite podcast app. They can find Unity 2020 at Articles of Unity on Twitter. They can find articlesofunity.org on the web, where they can read our white paper, the description of our plan. But I would say that's it. Definitely tune into the Dark Horse podcast, though. You'll get more of this discussion twice a week.
Beauty. All right, guys, if you guys want all the links, we'll put it in the show notes. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, we'll put this in the description. Make sure you guys go check out what Bret's up to. Bret, thanks so much for coming on, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks. It was a great discussion.